everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with some great guests that I think you're really going to enjoy. Before we get started, let me tell you about the Share the Arrows conference. You've heard us talk about this, and it's for a good reason. Share the Arrows is one of the most powerful women's events happening this year, and it's hosted by Blaze TV's own Allie Beth Stuckey. It's happening October 11th in Dallas, Texas. If there's a woman in your life that's been craving real encouragement and biblical truth, your wife, your daughter, your sister, this event is for her. It's a full day of worship, teaching, and powerful conversations. We all know how loud the culture can get, and this is a chance to push pause, lean into truth, and get recentered in purpose. Send someone you love or go yourself. Tickets and details are available at sharethearrows.com. And yes, the VIP options are still available. All right, guys. So I have been rereading Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. It's actually one of the first major political works I read in college. I did my first big research paper on this, but it's been 20 plus years at this point since I actually read it, and a lot has changed since then. So I wanted to revisit it. One of the things that struck me about it was during the text, Hobbes just out of nowhere mentions that Christ obviously with his resurrection ended the old gods. He sealed them away. They no longer can speak to us or influence us anymore. And I found that interesting because he dropped it very casually, as if this is just a fact that, of course, everybody knows. And, I was familiar with it. It's actually something of a fascination with my wife. She's read a couple different kind of accounts of this, and she's really fascinated by this concept. So it's always something that's been in conversation with us about, kind of what has happened in the spiritual realm since Christ's victory. And so I thought it would be really interesting to talk about this because honestly, this is something that I eventually learned about, but I never heard about in church growing up. And I think the majority of modern Christians are probably not super familiar with this idea of both history and theology. And so today I've got a great opportunity because I've got two returning guests, one a historian. Alex Petkas is here from from the Cost of Glory podcast. And then I have Anderw Isker, obviously pastor, and he has his own podcast over with CJ Engel. Thank you both for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Absolutely. So like I said, I wanted to hit this from both angles because I think what's really interesting about this is that it's something that shows up in the historical record in multiple places from multiple sources who I don't think are particularly motivated to tell the story that it tells. And that's always a good sign of historical veracity when you have people who would rather not admit something talking about it along with those who are celebrating. It gives us a cross-section of people who observe the event. And then obviously it also has deep theological implications, which I thought would be very good to have Anderw on since he's more familiar with that aspect. So let's start from the historical to set the frame. Alex, can you give us a little bit of an idea of where this comes from? Who is talking about this event of the old gods being sealed away, no longer being able to contact them? Where is this recorded in history?
Well, one of the most famous instances of this is the Emperor Julian that we discussed on an earlier episode. And he, so the story goes, was interested in reviving the Oracle of Delphi because it had fallen on bad times. He was, the famous apostate emperor a generation or so after Constantine in 361. And he wanted to revive the old gods. And so he's rebuilding temples all around the empire. And he sends a friend of his, Oribasius, this doctor, vizier sort of figure, to go, inquire, how can we rebuild the temple? And he gets this oracle back that says, go and tell the emperor, the ornate hall has fallen. No longer does Phoebus Apollo have his chamber, nor prophetic laurel, nor prophetic spring, and the speaking water has been silenced. And this is an interesting event. There's some interesting multiple interpretations of this, but essentially it's seen as kind of the last oracle of Delphi being offered. And yet this was the end of a long process that you can see in earlier sources. One of the earliest sources that we have for an actual decline in oracles and in prophecies is Plutarch, who was a 1st century AD philosopher, biographer, very dear to my heart, who wrote a treatise on the decline of oracles. He wrote several treatises on the shrine of Apollo at Delphi. He was, from the neighborhood. He ended up later in life becoming a priest there. So he's, very knowledgeable about the goings on at the Oracle of Delphi. And he, asked this question: why is it that, well, for one thing, the Oracle seems to be not speaking in the way that it used to speak. So if you read Herodotus or a lot of the earlier ancient historians, the typical process was when you consult the Oracle at Delphi, which is in central Greece, about this or that issue, you get in response usually a verse of hexameters, which is the epic meter that used by Homer and Hesiod, and this very ancient dialect. And what probably happened is, you as a petitioner, you go and consult the Pythia, the prophetess, and maybe they let you watch as she sits on this tripod and kind of mutters something interesting but incoherent in this trance-like state, possibly brought on by ethylene gas emitting from the cracks. There's interesting theories about this. And then the priests are there and they kind of, listen and go consult among themselves. And I'm sure that rituals are offered, but they come back to the petitioner with this hexameter. They kind of process it into something slightly more rational, but usually also ambiguous, that is supposed to guide your action. And Plutarch says, well, now the prophet or the oracle doesn't speak in hexameters anymore. It's just, normal language. What happened? And he says, well, kind of tying in with this broader theme that you see in Plutarch of the decline of the Oracle of Delphi and of other oracles, the prophet or the oracle doesn't have the same kind of needs that he's serving today, because in the archaic and classical periods, the Oracle of Delphi was this very important, not just a religious shrine, but a political shrine. City-states would come, they would send ambassadors. Should we go to war? Should we try to topple this tyrant? Should I slaughter all of my enemies, etc.? And then the oracle would give something, action guiding. And part of the way that this worked, if you're, a cynical rationalist, is the Oracle of Delphi, the priests there get embassies from all over the Greek world. They have the pulse on everything that's going on, the broader political spectrum, and they're kind of able to actually offer some real concrete third-party neutral advice. But in Plutarch's day, the oracle is, in the Roman Empire. The Greeks are, they have some modest liberty and within their city-states, but they're basically subjects of Rome. And you have the Pax Romana. It's peaceful, great. We can build wealth and stuff, but there's not the same kind of political stakes operative in the Greek world. And so the oracle doesn't have the same kind of charge over human affairs. And so now mostly people are going there and asking, should I get married to XYZ? Should I travel? Should I lend money to this guy? And it's all kind of tedious. And Plutarch says, well, that's why, in point of fact, there are fewer priestesses operative. They went from 3 in the glory days down to 1, and they managed to get all the work done. It used to take 3 priestesses to see all the petitioners, and now it's only 1. So it's not that the oracle was totally silent at that point, but it clearly declined in political significance. And so Plutarch is an important source, but beginning with the 2nd, 3rd centuries, and especially the 4th century, you start to have debates among Christians and pagans. As Christians are becoming more prominent, some of the pagan intellectuals are saying this stuff is nonsense and we gotta do something. And one of the sources of evidence that they use actually is the veracity of oracles that prove that the pagan gods are still operative in the world. And a lot of the Christian church fathers push back and they cite other pagan sources that talk about how the oracles are declining. And there are various prophecies that they cite where somebody will petition, say, the oracle at Delphi or Claros or Didyma. I mean, there's many of these. And some of them have already been shut down by this point, like the famous oracle at Dodona in central Greece. It's just not operative anymore. And they're, a lot of people are getting back oracles saying, sorry, the god doesn't have anything to say. Maybe you should just offer a sacrifice and kind of pious contrition and hope that things will change someday. I mean, you get the sense that these priests are sort of starting to see a decline in their finances because people are consulting the oracles less. One of the explanations that some scholars have offered that's very interesting on this is you get the rise, just kind of organically within paganism in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, of astrology and various forms of, magic, divination, becoming a medium. You can, if you perform certain rituals, a philosopher will, be able to offer you some kind of, rubric where you can just sit in your triclinium and consult the gods on your own, kind of become your own oracle. And, clearly this would take from the market share of an important oracle like Delphi, especially if it's just, what god should I sacrifice to make the crops grow this year, and kind of petty, as it were, personal private matters. And so the Christian apologists are able to draw on this tradition. They also are reading Plutarch. Eusebius quotes from Plutarch's Decline of Oracles treatise extensively. And one of Plutarch's theories that Eusebius quotes is the idea that maybe, Plutarch himself says this, maybe the god Apollo kind of can't be bothered with these, petty private affairs, and he sends subordinates, subaltern, emissary in the form of daimones, lesser spirits, the daimons, as the actual producers of these prophecies. Like, it's like a lesser divinity, because Plutarch is already in this sort of early Neoplatonic world of seeing the gods as sort of above material concerns, which is a new thing compared with the classical period. And so Eusebius takes this and says, well, actually, the oracles are, just like Plutarch says, demons, because daimon has this very different resonance in the context of the Christian tradition, and the starting with the Septuagint, the demons are bad, right? For the pagans, the daimon is, just like a hero maybe, or a demigod, a lesser divinity. So that's one way to take it. Or you can take it the way that Athanasius takes it, and on the Incarnation, he talks about, let me see if I can pull up the quote here. He says, whereas formerly every place was full of deceit of the oracles, and the oracles of Delphi and Dodona and in Boeotia and Lycia and Libya and Egypt, et cetera, that they were held in high repute in men's imagination. Now, since Christ has begun to be preached everywhere, their madness has also ceased, and there is none among them to divine anymore. So I think he's, on the one hand, these archaeology does tell us that these centers are still, somewhat operative, at least as economic and political centers. I mean, there's still settlements and cities around these temples, but there's also a lot of evidence that people are not consulting them anymore. And sometimes they're consulting them and not getting any answers. And so the Christians really pounce on this until at the very latest you get, the last oracle at Delphi, or, Theodosius in 391, the emperor, the great Orthodox emperor Theodosius, puts a stop to all pagan ritual and sacrifices. And so he sort of outlaws the going to of temples for the sake of, consulting the divinities. So it is a very real, well-documented phenomenon. And there's a lot of, one could say more about kind of internal pagan skepticism of oracles and jugglery, as Hobbes talks about. And Hobbes is, very funny when he talks about the way that pagans divinize things like snakes and onions and such. But he's actually drawing on this tradition kind of within paganism of saying, these guys are mostly just charlatans, aren't they? So it's kind of a complicated story. We could talk about the reasons further on.
No, absolutely. I think it's fascinating as well that it, of course we will go into more depth on this, but from, that beginning there, it does sound that, like, yes, we see from multiple sources, that the great god Pan is dead and the oracles are no longer speaking the way they used to, but it's not exactly slamming the doors shut. It seems to be more of a process that is occurring, notably right after Christ's death and resurrection, but continues along a progression of a few hundred years before we hear what might be complete silence. And we can speculate on this a little bit, but my understanding at least is that while this veil is much more closed than it ever was, this is the reason that many people, well, not many people, but the people who do interact with these spirits today basically do through occult practices, because it's a more difficult. I guess you have to go a little harder in the paint. You have to commit yourself to something more evil, I think, and unfortunately, for the people who decide that they want to go down that path. And so perhaps the veil is never completely sealed, but it becomes much, much more difficult. But those are just my speculations. Andrew, we have multiple sources. We've got, historians, we've got Roman emperors, we've got the day-to-day lives of those who used to worship these gods. We've got, early church fathers. What are some of the theological implications? I know that not all of this is just in the Bible 100%, but many different traditions have a harrowing of hell type understanding of what happened with Christ. How does this apply to the theological realm?
Oh, quite a bit, actually. I guess this is it'll be a long answer for you, Auron, but
that's okay. He just got 15 minutes.
That's right.
We got the history, now we get the theology.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it to 15 minutes then. But I think, just to start with, growing up in the church, I grew up in fairly normal, regular evangelicalism. And you would read in the Bible, or you'd read in Sunday school about like ancient Israel, and how all throughout the Old Testament they're tempted by worshiping the foreign gods, the gods of the Canaanites, Baal and Ashtoreth, and all of them. And I think it was just a very materialistic sort of impulse that's just present everywhere, that it was always read in such a way where it's like, that's really stupid, because everybody knows those are fake. Yeah, everybody knows that's not real. So why would you worship just idols of stone and metal and things like this? And it wasn't until much later, maybe reading reading things like Hobbes, or early church fathers and things like that, that I was like, wait a minute, what if all those were real, right? What if Israelites were burning their children to Molech because they saw their neighbors doing it, and then they sacrifice their baby and their firstborn, and then they get 10 more kids, and all their crops grow really well, and everybody else not doing that isn't doing quite as well, right? You could see the incentive, right? Just the bare material incentive that would exist if those things were real, right? Why someone would be tempted, or an entire nation would be tempted to do such things. And it's like, well, then it really like changes your whole perspective on the Old Testament, where it isn't just like, oh, they're doing this stupid, silly, superstitious thing that everyone knows is fake. They're actually doing a real thing that is very evil, and you have to maintain the faith and hold the faith strong in order to resist those temptations. Then it becomes very, very different, those stories. And just biblically, like you see all sorts of stuff. You see a material, modern materialistic Christian might read the Old Testament law, right, the law of Moses, and see that witchcraft is punished by death, divination is punished by death, things like idolatry are face the death penalty. You think, well, that's really extreme for just something that is silly superstition, like going to a palm reader or something, right? But it's like, well, wait, what if it's real and it's a real thing? Then you can see why it merits such severe punishment in the Old Testament. And then you also see things like Moses in Egypt doing miracles, and Pharaoh's magicians and priests are able to replicate the first few of them themselves. Or you look at like the Magi in the Gospels, and they're able to discern something from the heavens to be able to know, okay, Jesus is being born, we need to go over here. Like these guys are astrologers that are able to read the sky in some some way that people can't anymore. And or in the book of Acts, where a girl who's possessed by a demon is being used to do fortune telling, much like Alex describing the Oracle of Delphi. Um, and it's like, whoa, like the Bible's treating this stuff as real. It's not like modern people do, where it's like, oh, it's just hokey, silly, superstitious stuff. Like, no, it's very, very, very real. Much less all like the man possessed by, that was actually our lectionary reading on Sunday, the man possessed by demons. And It's like he has so many, he's not in his right mind, and he's living out in the tombs and stoning himself. And um Jesus casts them out and the people make him leave. I mean, this is actually, right, that's something that Rene Girard points out as, like, the reason for that is they needed that guy to be demon possessed for their whole society to function. Um, and yeah, Girard makes a lot of hay with those points. And so yeah, once you realize that the world is not just mere matter and stuff, that it is, that there are things behind it, that they're very real things, or at least there were. Then then so much of the Bible makes a whole lot more sense. But from a larger, theological, almost meta narrative, I mean, the way of looking at all of these things is that, okay, you have the fall, where Adam, prior to the fall, is created as a son, right, inheriting the entire world and ruling over the entire world, giving has been given rule of the creation. But he falls, and he's no longer in that position to rule, and so someone else does rule. And you begin to see some of these things, especially like if you take the Septuagint translation of Deuteronomy 32, that all the nations are divided at Babel, and each of them is given their own god, right, lowercase g god. Then the ancient world, the Old Testament world, makes even more sense, right? That they have all their own particular gods that rule over them. Uh, and it makes, like, the book of Daniel make a whole lot of sense as well, right? Um, where the archangel Michael is like, yeah, I had to stop. I had to take a break. I couldn't get to you right away, Daniel, because I was busy fighting the Prince of Persia. And it's like, oh, I wonder what that is. Like, it's not a human being that he's fighting. He's fighting the this principality, this power that rules over Persia. And you see that in Paul's epistle to the Ephesians, to the church at Ephesus, that he says, like, explicitly, right, you're not doing battle against flesh and blood. You're doing battle against principalities and powers, and the spiritual forces of darkness in the heavenly places. That there are things far beyond what we can see, and they exist, and they're real. And so, right, within Christian theology, like the fact that Christ comes, takes on flesh, dies on the cross, and is raised again, and then uh, he ascends to heaven to rule. Right, that's the thing. Especially like modern American Christianity is very, very much downplayed. Right, we don't have many categories to think through the ascension and what it actually means. But he is a man, right? The God man, 100% God, 100% man, is reigning from heaven at God's right hand over everything. He's taking the throne that Adam lost at the fall, and he has, like he says in the Gospels, he's bound the strong man and plundered his goods. Right, he's bound Satan and taken everything away from him. I mean, I think there's another clue there as well. In Matthew's Gospel, in the temptation in the wilderness, where Satan is offering him these temptations, right? And the last one is, I'll give you all the nations and all of their glory, right? If you would just bow down and worship me. And yeah, oftentimes I would hear that explained like, well, Satan is a liar. He's lying about stuff. Like, he doesn't actually possess all the nations and all their glory. And that never really held much water for me, because it wouldn't be much of a temptation if it was fake, right? If
Right.
it wasn't real, right? It's a real temptation that Jesus was facing. that he wouldn't have to go through all of this. Or the other thing that people will say is, well, he doesn't really want it, right? My kingdom's not of this world. I don't really want it. It's not. I don't want it. It's like, well, that's not a temptation either if it's not a thing that he wants, right? And so if you take what Satan tempts Jesus with in the wilderness as real, as something he actually possesses, and as something Jesus wants, then and you can see why he would want it. Like you look at all the Psalms, like Psalm 2, right, ask of me, right? The Father is saying to the Son in that Psalm, ask of me and I'll give the nations to you as an inheritance. It's like, it seems like he really wants it. So he wants it. Satan is offering it, and he resists the temptation by saying, no, I'm not going to just accept it from you. I'm going to take it from you. Right. I'm going to die and be raised again and ascend to heaven to rule. Which is precisely what he did. And then especially like if you get into the book of Revelation, which is always precarious because there are all sorts of different ways to read the book of Revelation that many people do. It's currently probably a very contentious political issue right now at this exact moment, as we saw with Tucker and Ted Cruz last week. But in the book of Revelation, right, you see in chapter 5, right, you see the ascension from the perspective of heaven, right, that the Lamb comes and takes the throne, and all of the the ancient ones surrounding the throne, the 24 ancient ones, and all of the angels, right, what do? They take off their crowns and set them at his feet, right? And so if you think about like the spiritual, theological, symbolic meaning of what that is right. You have this interregnum almost from Adam to Christ, where the rulers of the world were the the uh, the smaller lowercase g gods, or the created being, the angels and demons, right? All the spiritual beings are ruling over the world, and he ascends to heaven, and they take off their crowns and give them to him. Now all of that power belongs to him, and it isn't just like the heavenly ones; it's all of it, right? All of their power belongs to Jesus, and you see that transition from the heavenly host ruling the creation to humanity in Christ, in Jesus, and in his church, in his people. And you also see this later in Revelation, where the instruments, right, the instruments of spiritual warfare that the heavenly host has, are their instruments that they're singing with in heaven. But the transition takes place where the saints now pick up the heavenly instruments. I think it's in chapter 17, where they take up the heavenly instruments. They're replacing, right, the angels, right? So people always accuse me of like, you believe in replacement theology, and I'm like, yes, I do. Right?
Replacement of angels.
Human beings replace angels. That's what I believe. That's the great replacement that's taking place in the Bible. That the powers of the heavenly host, both the ones faithful to God and the ones in rebellion against him, are replaced. They're replaced by the church, and they're replaced by Christ himself. And so, you see this, and it makes it's particularly important, especially with a lot of the things that Alex just said, to look at like the book of Daniel and what's taking place there. And you have, especially like within dispensationalism, you have people reading the book of Daniel as though it's describing, today, things taking place today. But what it's actually describing is that period, of what's often called the intertestamental period, those hundreds of years between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the Gospels, where you have Babylon take over, then Persia, then Greece, then Rome, and you see that this is part of God's plan to build what's called in the New Testament the oikomene, right? The known world, right? This Greco-Roman world, right? This huge empire, that it begins to be consolidated. And in Nebuchadnezzar's vision that Daniel describes, right, the thing that finally replaces it is this stone that grows into a mountain, which is the kingdom of Christ. And so, right, if all of these great world empires are, backstopped by demons, right, like you see in sort of glimpses in with the vignette about the Prince of Persia fighting Archangel Michael, ultimately the thing that replaces them and is handed over is to the church, is to the kingdom of God. And so that's like within this period, like that is the thing that is taking place, that God is raising these peoples up, right? And it makes it like, when you have this understanding of what's actually going on, it actually makes reading about Alexander, and it makes reading Herodotus, and makes reading all of the ancient histories take on a completely new life, because it's like, well, actually God is the one orchestrating all of this to hand over that world to his son. And then, right, so you can extrapolate from that, all of the conquests of over paganism by the church, by the gospel, to the rest of the world beyond the Okomene, right, the barbarian world, right, the world of my ancestors in Northern Europe, because like Norse paganism kept going on for another maybe 1,000 years, but it too was conquered. And it's fascinating reading the stories about the wars between the Danes and the Anglo-Saxons in England. I mean, they completely conquered England except for Wessex, and yet they were defeated ultimately. And so many of the Danes converted to Christianity. It's wild stuff. And it's like, well, why did they? And it was the same kind of thing. It was their gods started going silent. They wouldn't speak anymore. And the only conclusion they could have is that the Christian God is more powerful. And I mean, yeah, even I'm glad that that Alex brought up Julian the Apostate, because it's also fascinating too that one of the things that Julian did in his program to try to return, is he really wanted to spite the Christians by rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. And so he gave a whole bunch of money to the Jews in the empire to return to Judea, rebuild the temple. And like, you can go on Wikipedia of all places and read about the attempted reconstruction of the temple in the 4th century. And like day one of construction, they get all the materials together, they spend all the money to get it ready, get it planned, and like day one, the earth opens up and swallows everything up, and fire comes from heaven and destroys all of it. And it's like, and these are pagan sources.
Right, yeah, Alex and I actually already did a episode on this, like a full episode on it. It's amazing, but yeah, the fact that this is reflected once again in pagan sources, across all of this is really fascinating. And the world you're describing is one that I think is itself. A lot of people in kind of the online right will talk about the need to re-enchant the world, right? Like to re-understand it in a way like this. And I think that is increasingly important, because when we look, the funny thing about Hobbes is, while he is making this casual reference, most of Hobbes is him kind of trying to say, well, angels and demons, these are just kind of delusions. These are ultimately not direct forces. They're not material. It's kind of demystifying the Christian. And this is, of course, one of the first steps down the Enlightenment path of, okay, the world is just this clockwork mechanism. And if God does exist, he just kind of made it and walked away, and it kind of runs by itself. But when you look in these ancient sources, like when you look at a work like The Ancient City by Collage, he talks specifically about how each god is particular to those nations, how important it was for them to be personal and particular, and how they bound the nations together. And if you could go in and trick the god of one city-state into taking your sacrifice, then that would open them up to attack. And these are not minor things. These are not just like stories that they told. These are very real and important beliefs, and that were held and understood. And it really jives with this idea that there are these spiritual entities that these nations have been given over to until they were defeated by God's instruments. And I always think of C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet, right? You think about that book, and he says, the humans go to all these planets, and the natives there seem so simple, and they're so backwards, and we can control them because ultimately, and they don't realize that all of those people look at them with a sadness because actually their ruling angel, Lucifer, fell. And so your planet is silent. All the other planets get to communicate with God. All the other peoples get to sing with God, but you're silent because your guardian spirit fell and has now corrupted you. And this is why everyone looks at you with pity, because you don't really understand what it means to be communing with God in a very real way. And so I just find that fascinating because, we see this concept echoed in non-Christian, thinkers as well. You look at someone like Spangler talking about metaphysical, animating spirits of different civilizations. Everything about this isn't necessarily always Christian, but it's recognized across many different disciplines. And so I just think it's hitting on something really critical that we've lost in the modern day. But the more we look at events around us, I think it becomes more and more obvious that the spiritual warfare, in my mind, is ramping back up, not toning back down.
Yeah. And to go on one of these points with regards to Hobbes, he's a rationalist, he's maybe Epicurean sympathetic. It's important to note that this option was available very much to ancient thinkers. And there's a philosopher, Oenomaus of Gadara, that Eusebius quotes at length. And this guy wrote a treatise Goeton Fora, the exposure of the charlatans. And so he goes around to all these oracles, and he goes, I think it's the oracle of Apollo that he goes to, where he asks the priest, okay, I bought some land, I'm trying to figure out what I should plant in the land, and the priest comes back with this oracle like, oh, in the fields of Hercules the flowers bloom and the plants are rich and the rains ever fall. And it's kind of like ambiguous and vague, but maybe encouraging if you're a man of faith. And then Oenomaus says, well, this was encouraging at first until I started asking around, other people were there, and it turns out Callisthenes got exactly the same oracle. And upon further research, he discovers that dozens of people got this exact same oracle. And it seems like, as he tells the story, the priests kind of have this fishbowl of various
my fortune cookie came out the same.
Exactly.
Right.
And so so he's saying, well, this is all nonsense, these are charlatans, that the gods may exist, but they don't really do this sort of thing. That's not the line that a lot of the pagans took about the decline of oracles, and it's certainly not the line that the Christians took. Eusebius, like we said earlier, certainly thinks that there are spiritual forces operative at these sites. They're just bad. And I think Athanasius would take the same. And it's the fact that they're falling silent is not some kind of historical process of, purely at least, of the declining Greco-Roman liberty and political independence. There's like a lot more going on there, despite what the demystifiers would tell you. And I think this kind of connects to, you can kind of have it both ways, actually, because there is, on the one hand, this very lively ancient economy, I'd say a modern economy too, of kind of charlatanry and I don't know, getting people to go on ayahuasca trips and my ayahuasca startup and stuff like that. There is a kind of economic force driving this, and the crystal sellers on Etsy and that kind of thing has an economic dimension to it, a kind of grift to it. But that could be precisely the very effective tool that malign spiritual forces use to kind of draw you in. There's all these people out there who have a stake in persuading you to experiment and contact the dead, and they can make some money on it. And that might make you think that it's fake. That's what Hobbes would say, right? In that passage, he's talking about how religious authority kind of becomes less credible when it's seen to be upholding the personal interests of the religious authority itself. Of course, this has to do with his critique of the Catholic Church, but it could also be both, and that they're overdetermined, that there are spiritual forces that kind of use that as a hook to draw you in and send you down the slippery slope.
So Andrew, looking at all these different sources and the possibility of this, process that has started with the death and resurrection of Christ, but continues on, as you point out, even in, a century later with some of these other pagan peoples that are being contacted. What do you think? And again, this might just be speculation. Don't, if it's not something that you want to go into, or if it's something that you feel is on some level of speculation, just feel free to make that clear. But uh, do you think ultimately that whatever spirits, be they the old gods, demons, whatever was being contacted previously through these religious rituals, do you think they have been removed from contact with this plane? Do you have the inclination that I have, that they're still contactable through evil, the very evil rituals that require more effort, I think, by some? Do you think that they could come back? Is there any indication that any of these things might be something we still interact with on a regular basis?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a question I get a lot. It's one I've thought about a lot as well. No, I think that it isn't so much that, like, okay, now they're completely gone, they're eradicated, they are totally defeated forever and sealed away. But I do think that their power is greatly attenuated by the victory of Christ. That I mean, if you take my perspective on the Book of Revelation, that Satan, his power is sealed, right? That we're living in that period after the ascension, and but within that, um, right, there still is something there, right? Even though they are not, they don't have the power to dominate entire civilizations any longer. And you see it as it's played out in history, right? First in the Greco-Roman Empire, then throughout all of Europe, you have Christendom, you have the destruction of the power of the old gods everywhere that Christianity went. Um, and I mean, you even look at things like, I mean, it's interesting to me. In college, I had to read African history, and there isn't obviously a whole lot of sub-Saharan African history, but I had to take this class for my degree, and one of the things they had us read was Chinua Achebe's "Things Fall Apart." Maybe you had to read that too when you were in school. And Achebe is a Christian, and he's describing the period of Christianity coming to Nigeria, I believe. And and one of the things he describes is, like, when the missionaries came, the people there are like, oh yeah, you can set up your church or your hospital or school or whatever over there in that part over there, not telling them, well, that place is haunted, that's full of evil spirits, and they're going to be cursed and tormented. And what he described is, not only were they not cursed and tormented by the demons that resided there, the all of the magic of the witch doctors in the village just ceased. It just
Mm.
stopped. Right? They'd roll the chicken bones or whatever and to do divination, and it was like staking the magic 8 ball and saying, "Ask again later," every single time. And it's like, that's interesting. That's fascinating. Or even if you think about the Spanish conquistadors, like Cortez conquering the Aztecs,
Right.
and how miraculous that was, right? How this tiny little band of Spanish conquistadors that don't have massive technological superiority over the Aztecs. Yeah, they have horses and cannons, but it's not like they had M249 saws and
It's
and
no
uh, and
attack
tanks and
helicopters
stuff.
spraying
Yeah,
the yeah. Yeah.
it's not like when you play Civilization on easy mode and you're like 2 ages ahead of all the other civilizations, and you're using stealth bombers against swordsmen or something. And so anyway, they completely overturned the Aztec Empire, like, overnight, right? It's really this miraculous story, and it's like, well, what caused that? Why did that happen? And you think about the Aztecs and what their civilization was, and how it's dominated by these just disgusting gods that sacrificed I don't know, hundreds of thousands or millions of people, building entire pyramids of skulls, things like that, and then boom, they're gone, they're done, and like all of their own prophecies had said like this is going to happen. Is fascinating stuff, man. And so you think about those things, or even, I mean, even the conquest of the Americas, it's very similar. That as Europeans came, as European Christians came, that all of the power, all of the witchcraft and things like that just stopped working. It doesn't work anymore. But even so, I say all that, but even as like Christendom came in Europe, there still was an undercurrent of folk religion and occult practices and witchcraft and things like that was very real. We often look at like the Salem witch trials and the things that happened there as like, oh, well, these superstitious people just started to burn women for no reason. And it's like, no, like weird stuff really did happen that was testified by multiple people that has no rational explanation whatsoever. And it's like, yeah, like the Americas was a very dark place, very evil place that Christianity helped to mostly eradicate. But is the question though is like, can these things come back? I think it's ultimately a spiritual battle, and the fact that some of these things appear to be coming back shows the weakness of the church, and it shows the decline of Christianity as a public religion. That the fact that it's coming back, I think, it points to that we are rapidly de-Christianizing, and it is funny that like the new atheism that existed in like the early 2000s, like when we were in college, like that's not really a thing anymore. I mean, the Fedora Shrek meme really killed it, but
well, and the
but it's
fact
not
that like the guys who pushed it are now opining about waiting. Oh, what happened to my Christianity?
Yeah, that's right,
Dawkins
yeah.
being like, oh, I got rid of Christ, and all of a sudden, these Muslims control
really
every
bad.
building, and they're
Yeah,
destroying
it's
my
horrible.
civilization. What happened? Yeah,
Yeah,
here are the
exactly.
fruits. Yeah.
And some of it too is like it just created a vacuum that is filled by something, right? And so all of these people, right, that profess to be atheist or agnostics or whatever, now they're like, I mean, like Aaron Rodgers, for example, I think is like kind of the poster child for this. Like grows up in an evangelical Christian home, then becomes this kind of like neckbeard atheist, but then from there progresses to like ayahuasca trips and sweat lodges and things like that, right? Like, yeah, like demons filled that vacuum. Like that's what happened, and that's like he's a microcosm of all of these things. And so, right, why is it happening? Well, it's because Christianity's lost its teeth, right? It's no longer operates as a very potent spiritual force in our society. It's really just this kind of self-help thing for many people. It's not a real powerful actual religion, right? Where you are communicating with God, where God is bestowing his grace upon you in very tangible, real ways, right? We don't view it that way anymore because I think we've been given over to the same Enlightenment thinking created by men like Hobbes.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting. You point out here that in a lot of ways, perhaps it's not immediately just the death or resurrection of Christ, but it is when God decides to move a civilization towards Christianity, when the Christians arrive, and it's time to be witness to, the magic shuts down, right? All of a sudden the power is stolen. But if that vacuum is created again, then that evil can rush back. And it's very interesting because I obviously talk a lot about people doing political theory, doing pretty radical out there understandings of political philosophy. And a lot of these guys are talking about hyper agents. And hyper agents is a fancy word for demons. Right?
That's right.
It's what rationalists want to call demons, because all these people who don't have a word for spiritual warfare are looking at what's happening around them, and there are entities that are not human that seem to be reassembling themselves before our eyes. We're starting to watch powers that we cannot totally grasp and understand, who are very different on our own, start to mobilize people in different directions. And that's one of those things that, again, people who are totally unconnected to religious traditions are trying to describe to me. And I'm like, yeah, I feel like I'm doing the Michael J. Fox meme. Like, I've seen this one before. Like, I know what this is.
Yeah.
This is, I know something you don't know here. And so, I know some people out there are just tuning out. They're like, okay, these guys are nuts or whatever, but I don't care. Like, sorry, I've seen around these corners, and this is very real. I have talked to people who completely have no idea about Christianity, completely are disconnected from theological traditions, and are still recognizing exactly this pattern. Very serious, very learned people repeatedly coming to this conclusion. And so, Alex, I know we've kind of been deep into the spiritual side on this, but I don't know if you have anything that you want to kind of bring up in reference to this process of the possibility of these different powers or these different forces returning in different areas.
Well, there's certainly, this story about Africa that Andrew was talking about. It's the kind of thing occurs a lot in the early saints' lives. And in fact, I think it's in Ammianus, the Emperor Julian has this half-brother, Gallus, who was a Christian, kind of nuts, but, he was a Christian, and he transferred the relics of the martyr Babylas to right in the neighborhood of the temple of Apollo at Daphne, which is in Antioch, and it silenced the oracle. And Julian, took this seriously enough that when he got there to Antioch, as Gallus had died by this point, he took the remains of Babylas and moved them way far away again, and I think he hid them or something. But it actually worked. There's all these instances of planting a church near a pagan oracle, or burying some martyrs' remains near a pagan oracle, and it kind of the pagan priests are like, what the hell is going on? And they find who did it. Maybe it's a saint, and they execute him. Things like that recur all over the place, and it can't just be all a trope. But there's a really interesting story about Julian, this specific oracle that we were talking about, that I'm not sure how to make sense of it, but one interpretation of the prophecy that was given to Julian by Apollo, and there's some debate, it might have been Apollo at Daphne, actually, but either way, one way of reading the prophecy, if you change the punctuation, it goes from being no longer does Phoebus have his chamber, nor prophetic laurel, nor prophetic spring, and the speaking water has been silenced, to something like Phoebus no longer has his chamber, but he has not fallen silent with regard to the prophetic laurel, nor the prophetic spring and the speaking water. So there's a kind of a grammatical ambiguity that essentially, if on the second interpretation, the oracle is kind of positive, like, yes, okay, the roof fell in, but hey, Apollo's still there, Julian. So if you want to repair his temple, he's going to come back, and the oracle is going to be restored. And this is a modern scholarly conjecture. But if that's right, then essentially what happened is the story you could tell is the oracle is doing the same thing that it's always done, which is deliver these ambiguous kind of tragic prophecies. Like famously, the oracle delivered to Croesus of Lydia when he was thinking about invading Persia. You will topple a great empire if you invade Persia. And certainly no modern resonances today. And of course, the empire that he toppled was his own empire when Cyrus, retaliated and toppled Lydia and captured Lydia. So this could be, if you wanted to go on this line, this is like the kind of the forces of good co-opting the oracle of Apollo to kind of drive Julian deeper into his tragic blindness and misinterpretation. Oh, I got a good sign from the god. All right, he's probably on my side. I can go march into Persia, as he does, and then he dies famously on a Persian campaign. Again, no modern resonances at all. But actually, the prophecy was saying, the Oracle is dead and it's not this is not true anymore. It's just like such a fascinating, strange, ambiguous episode. So I think these forces are still at work in the world today for sure. And it's like C.S. Lewis said, the devil's greatest trick is to make you think that he doesn't exist, right?
Absolutely. And guys, I know there are big world events happening today. I know this is the only podcast that's not talking about them right now.
Everyone else is monitoring the situation. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Well, so two reasons for this. One, obviously, just we scheduled this previously because the world ended right after I asked you guys to do this. But also, this is not a breaking news podcast. There's a lot of people who do that, and they obviously it's a huge niche, and there's big audiences there. But right now, I've got a very large stream count. This is one of the larger streams I've done in quite a while. Watching this, I think people, we can sit there and wring our hands about what's going on, but we don't know everything that's happening, and it's a lot of knee jerk. Look, I have the same impulse as everybody else. I'm concerned, but ultimately, we're not sure how this is all going to shake out. And I could sit here and speculate and throw out useless stuff that's going to be wrong in 2 minutes, or we could talk about eternal and powerful things. And then when the dust settles and we have a better idea of what's going on, we can delve into the geopolitical issues and their implications. So, honestly, like we're talking about here, and as Alex just pointed out, there are plenty of parallels inside this story that apply to our current situation. We don't have to run out there and look for the breaking news in order to kind of better understand our world. In fact, in some ways, understanding these foundations and these eternal truths are just as, if not more important than the current relevant facts for grasping what's happening. But before we go to the questions of the people, Andrew, I want to ask you this. One problem, and I feel this a lot, not to insult our beloved boomers, but I did the episode on boomer eschatology, and I've made this point before, but I want your take on it. I think one of the big problems we have, especially as Christians and especially as American Christians, is because American Christianity has been so central to America. It's been so powerful. America has been so deeply blessed and has not really, we've faced difficulties, but compared to other nations, we're isolated. We're not being invaded all the time. No one's coming to massacre us here. Let's be real. We're financially powerful. We have a world-spanning empire. And so it's been very easy to take the Christian story of God wins in the end, right? Christ wins in the end, which is of course true. And I believe and I affirm, but it's been easy to take that story and graft it into the United States. That the United States and Christianity are one thing, and of course, the United States will always be Christian, and the victory of America will be the victory of Christianity, and America can't lose because Christianity doesn't lose. And I think this creates a hubris in the American spirit, but also it creates a lax understanding for Christians of their duty, because they look around and they say, well, God's going to win at the end. And so, maybe I play with the Ouija board. Maybe it doesn't matter if, my kid ends up, practicing a little witchcraft. Maybe, if the spiritual forces around me that are attacking, they're all probably just, bunk. They're all, that's a bunch of nonsense from the old days. And we rationally arrived at this Christian understanding. And so we got that locked down, and now just Christ wins, and I never have to worry about that again. What do you think about the complacency that I think is sometimes bred by what I believe is a true fact that, of course, eventually Christ will conquer all, but at this moment, we still have a duty to be mindful of the spiritual forces around us and the fact that that battle is ongoing?
No, I think you're absolutely right that there is a tremendous amount of complacency, right? There's so many factors involved. I mean, some of it is, just being born on third base and thinking you hit a triple. The peace and order and stability that we enjoy is really like all we've ever known, and so you just assume that's the baseline. I think part of it also is the impact that the Enlightenment has had on all of us and all of our thinking, that a lot of us like functionally are deists, right? Even though we don't profess to be at all. Our day-to-day lives are very deistic, where it's like, God just winded up the clock and he's not really involved at all. And so part of the effort, when people, and actually hate like using the language of enchanting the world, things like that, even though I maybe said that in my book, but but I've grown to not really like it so much, because it takes on a certain flavor that sometimes is very silly, um but the reality is like the people that are beginning to look at the world in a different way, and paying attention to metaphysics, and thinking about the world, that it is more than just matter and stuff, that there are things far beyond what we can know and see. I mean, so much of it too is like you have a massive amount of the population that is suffering from various degrees of mental illness, right? Whether it's anxiety or depression or things, even more severe than that. And coupled with that, a tremendous amount of drug use, right? Whether it's, just, marijuana or whatever, or many other things. That like that stuff, like pharmakia, man, like that is, it's not just like ayahuasca, going to the shaman in Belize or something, but it's like like drug use is a real thing. Like it's like pharmakia, that is talked about in the New Testament. Like you're opening yourself up to who knows what, and rather than looking at it in materialistic terms, like, oh well, different chemicals are affecting your brain, and altering your mind. It's like, well, yeah, on the material side, yes, but like what's happening on the spiritual side with these things? Like, all of these things, I think have caused many people to begin looking at the world differently, begin looking at it from a non-enlightenment perspective, and there definitely is a need and a demand for answers, and it's one thing that I think the majority, or at least the mainstream of at least American evangelicalism, is very reticent to give. Right, they don't want to get into sort of speculative theological things, even though all the stuff that I've said it isn't really on the skinny branches of speculative theology. It's
Right,
like
right.
right there in the New Testament, right there in the Old Testament. Like it's right there for you to see if you're just willing to take off, your enlightenment goggles for 1 second. And so, yeah, I think the big part of it is, right, you begin understanding that, all right, the things that I'm doing, the life that I'm living, the day-to-day Christian piety that I pursue, that my family pursues, worshiping on the Lord's Day, all of that isn't just like, oh, this is good stuff to do because God wants us to do it, but it's also going on the offensive, right? It's also, I mean, it's like the story of Chabe's, of the missionaries going to Africa and going on the offensive against their gods. Like that's what's happening, and you have no idea what the effect is of faithful living and faithful worship, and how it silences these old gods that in many ways are coming back to haunt our world. And I just look at it from like the broad like geopolitical side of things as well, right? It's just so interesting to me that there's this like demonic screeching at the idea of Christians who want Christianity to be a very public religion and to have, political and societal impact, right? That's like the only thing they freak out about more than anything else. Is like, we can't have that, anything but that. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. Why is that? Right. Well, it's probably because you worship demons, right? That's why. So yeah, I think just as there are big, massive geopolitical things happening right now in the world that we're living in, right? There's stuff beyond that we can't see, that just by to throw a bone to the sweet old boomer folks that were just, living a faithful Christian life for 60, 70 years, right? Them praying and worshiping and following Jesus, right, had this massive impact on the world that they can't even see or know, and maybe are not willing to recognize.
I just wanted to jump on that, the way you put that beautiful, Andrew. And like speaking of people that were born on third base and thought they hit a home run, the ancient Israelites, for example, did that.
Yeah.
And God sent plagues and chastised them, and he, burned their temple down and sent them off to Babylon. And I've just read recently Ernst Junger's On the Marble Cliffs. And if you want a kind of depiction of what that might look like when a society thinks it's fine and kind of allows itself to slip and lose faith, and the encroachment of terror and chaos and tyranny and lesser divinities, hostile divinities, kind of creeps in and sweeps through a land. It's a chilling depiction of that. I really enjoyed it. It's a quick read, less than 150 pages. So, and of course, Ernst Junger, writing in the 30s, of course, but he eventually becomes a Catholic, seriously. And these things really have material historical consequences when you lose faith, even if you're unsure about whether it's God's chastisement, which I think is very reasonable to think. Just because you have a Christian nation, that might actually hold you up even more intensely to the punishment of God if you turn away. The ensuing chaos that comes from the collapse of an incredibly ordered system is much, much worse than just typical village destruction. I mean, it's just catastrophic. So I think that it starts with just upholding the dignity of these things in your own personal life first and foremost. That's something that we all can do, at least.
Great. Another excellent book that I have to add to my incredibly tall stack that I might get through if God is kind enough to me. I keep trying to write a book about this, and every time I get a chapter or two done, I'm like, oh no, now I have to read an entire another book to understand the next chapter I'm going to write. All right, guys. Well, I appreciate both of you coming on. I think this has been a fascinating discussion. I'm really happy that we were able to pull this off and that both of you were able to make it. Andrew, obviously working from the from the hotel room, so he's dedicated to his craft.
That's right.
But before we go, or at least before we start taking questions from the people, Alex, can you tell people where to find your great work?
Yes, Cost of Glory on all the podcast players, including YouTube. If you go to costofglory.com, that's my website. It's got links to stuff.
Excellent. And then
at Cost of Glory on Twitter, I should say, too, or on X.
Yeah. For me, just at Boniface Option on X.com, and the podcast is Contramundum with CJ Engel, and that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever people get podcasts.
Excellent. All right, let's look at the question of the people, and both of you guys just jump in or not as you feel. Simplar says, "Oh wow, my favorite topic." Well, thank you very much for coming by, sir. Looks like you've got a few questions about it. He says, "You fine gentlemen might enjoy the Sibylline Oracles. It's a collection of lore and prophecies from monarch era Rome, supposedly from Troy. The Christians preserve the verses that most aligned with the Bible."
Yeah, this was a really popular text in late antiquity, and I'm rusty on the actual late antique reception of this, but the fourth eclogue of Virgil was another one of these texts that was written 30 or 40 BC, and mentions the birth of a new chosen ruler king. Historians think this is a child of Augustus, or like a nephew of Augustus, Marcellus, but the Christian church fathers saw this as well. Obviously, he's talking about Christ. It's like right around the corner. So there's all kinds of prophecies that maybe it's not all demons, or maybe the way that the church fathers were thinking about it, that there is room for seeing, let's say, angels speaking through these prophecies in a way that, in a way that some of the church fathers talk about, like, even though the Babylonians conquering Israel, God is going to punish the Babylonians anyway, but they're still instruments of God, working in the world. So there's ways of thinking about this that are kind of coherent and holistic. But
or it's like the pagan philosopher that Paul quotes, and also references the shrine in Athens to the unknown God, right, and like the backstory behind that, right? Where it's someone who said, okay, offer a sacrifice according to, in this way, and it was offered in the exact same way as like a Levitical sacrifice in the law of Moses, and the plague that had been afflicting Athens was lifted. And it's like, that's interesting. Like, where did that come from? How did he know to do that? Right. There's all sorts of weird stuff like that. And so and Paul's referencing it. So it's, somewhere between neutral to good.
Templar says also Enoch and Jubilee give lifespan of false gods at 300 to 500 years. So once they were cut off and sealed from sacrifices in this world, they started dying. That's why oracles gradually faded over 300 years.
Wow, that's fascinating. I've never heard that.
Yeah,
right.
me neither.
Probably did.
Yeah. It's possible. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, and the Olympian gods
before.
of the Greeks around their heydays in the 5th century BC, and by the time you get to the Roman Empire, they're kind of on the out as far as actual objects of faith. I mean, they're still there in the poets and in the shrines, but people are starting getting interested in Mithras and Cybele and the Caberoids. A lot of weird stuff starts happening right around that 400 to 500 year mark from the classical 12 gods of Greece. So I'm gonna have to chew on that.
Philosophical Thirstworm says the Jesuit figurists case that the Taoists anticipated the Christ via Shem and had a conceptualization of the Trinity is interesting. We're going to get all of the most esoteric references today.
Yeah, it is.
I'm glad to know that we have that kind of autistic horsepower in the chat. I'm proud of you kids.
That's right.
Indeed.
Yeah, no, that is fascinating. I mean, I saw one, maybe it was Elf Templar's, one of his other comments too. Like there is interesting stuff about like the sons of Noah, for example, being divinized.
Let's just read this one.
Here it is.
He says, my personal suspicion is that most gods began as great men, sons of Noah. Some may have been saints that when they died, demons disguised themselves as their spirits and subverted their memories.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of fascinating stuff about like, various like Japhethites, like Scythians and the people that preceded them and their particular religion. And it's like, it really does seem like because they're sort of monotheistic, and it's like they divinized Japheth and made him the main god, or their god, or the conception of God. And it's fascinating stuff. And it's like, that seems very plausible to me. And I mean, so much of this stuff though is like, well, I don't really know. It's weird. And so many of these peoples and their histories, there's just not much there that we have, that's extant, to know what is it they really believed or where did it come from.
And I think it's important to remember, a lot of us get uncomfortable when we're talking about spiritual matters and doctrine. If it's not directly in the Bible, then
That's right.
we can't talk about it. But of course, that wasn't true for most of Christian history. There are things that are canonical, that are divinely inspired, that we know to be very important. But that doesn't mean that there isn't other items that we can think about, that we can explore, that we can use historical and spiritual texts to try to better understand without giving them elevating to the level of like God breathed scripture in our eyes.
Absolutely.
On the Tao, there's a book that was often recommended to me that I never actually read called Christ, the Eternal Tao.
I've heard that one too. Yeah.
Or an Orthodox convert who was a practicing Taoist or something. So that might be good. Check that out. I've never read it, but sounds fascinating.
Possibly connected there. Brahmswingle says there are still places in the world where the spirits are wild and hostile to men. Best example is the American West. And yeah, I mean, if you look, guys, again, we're not going to get new agey on you here, but if you haven't been in the deep dark places of America and felt something stirring, I don't know. Either you're not connected, or I think you're making stuff up, or you're denying I don't know. Personally.
Yeah. There's a lot of weird stuff out there, and it's true, right? Like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think like the best modern prophet was probably the late David Lynch, right?
Like
talk
about
there's
taking
some weird
seriously.
stuff, man. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, Yeah. And I mean, did you see? I think it was Tucker on Bannon talking about like, yeah, nuclear weapons came from demons, man. Like that's
Yeah.
just that like
Which is funny because I think is like he stole that take from Gio Pinchetti. No.
maybe he did. Maybe he stole it from Geo. Maybe Geo got it from watching
right.
Twin Peaks: The Return or something.
Sure,
I don't know.
sure. I was just he's just hit that before multiple times. And so the minute I heard that, I was like, I've heard that before.
There it is. Yeah.
Senator Brundlefly says, I don't think it's coincidence that Oppenheimer thought of Vishnu when first dropping the atomic bomb. She was fashioned from the torn up floorboards of reality.
Yeah, there we go. That's
great minds.
We just were thinking about. Yeah, like it's weird, man.
Many of the great scientists wasn't. Well, a lot of chemistry comes from alchemy, right? Like a lot of these early scientists, like I don't know. I don't want to accuse Newton of being a Mason, but
I've heard things like that. Yeah,
he was not a Orthodox Trinitarian, right? Experimenting in the occult realms and probing into the secrets of nature seem to go hand in hand in dangerous.
I mean, he spent just as much time, if not more, investigating the spiritual world than he did the physical world, even though that's all we talk about now. People often discard a large part of the Enlightenment being cultic. Like they're just like, oh, it's about everybody's super rational. It's like, no, actually not at all if you look into it.
Yeah, I remember in high school having to take AP calculus, and now I know that was just demon stuff, man. I
knew that, even though I had none of the spiritual. That was my intuition. I didn't need any of the spiritual underlying to grasp that. Philosophical Thirstman says God uses the trappings weakness of paganry to bring people to him. He works through evil, so I assume he works through Ooga Booga fire gods too. Very fair. Yeah. He also says Christ's victory makes people complacent, but the Zoroastrians had a good conceptualization that worship is an active struggle alongside your God. And of course, to be very clear, Christianity has exactly this conception as well, right? It is about running the race. There is a path set before you. You are not you're not just riding in the sidecar of the Disneyland amusement park that is your life. And God's just put you on the track. Like of course, God has a plan, but you are an active participant. You are someone who is charged with the struggle. And so, the victory is inevitable because of Christ's overcoming, but that doesn't mean you don't have a very real role to play. And that doesn't mean that the spiritual conflicts that you are experiencing or that you're trying your best not to notice aren't real. They are very real.
Yeah, the cult of Mithras was, Zoroastrian religion that was very popular among the Roman soldiery. And I think that it might have had something to do with this. It's like a high agency version of salvation. And, when Christianity rises, it's also a very high agency version of salvation. The Militia Christi and this sort of thing like appeals to people who have a lot of responsibility and have high stakes placed on them. So interesting parallel.
We're not sure how to say this. Weird E Curb says 1 Corinthians 8:4 does say that an idol has no real existence. Where does this fit in with all this? Hope that makes sense. Either way, $5, Auron. Well, thank you very much, you guys. I'm assuming that Andrew is far more likely to know that particular address, but I don't want to put you on the spot. We haven't Googled this.
No, I think it's a good point. I mean, it's one that that people often make, and it's a difficult thing to balance because in the same epistle, right, Paul is talking about, people that eat food offered to idols and or that go to, temple cult prostitutes, things like that, that you are having communion with demons, right? That if you eat food offered to idols, you're eating with demons is what you're doing. And so it's very real, but like, I think that in particular is like reference to idol itself, like the physical object. And it's like, just destroy those things, man. Like don't even suffer them. Go ahead.
This is also something that I just did not understand until I read The Ancient City. Again, just talking about the seriousness with which, the pagan religions were taken in these times, that the joint eating of the sacrificial meal is what bonds the society together. It's what makes you part of that society, and that's what closes you to communion with other societies. That because you have taken that sacrifice and become part of that, you are not subject to other gods, you're not subject to other peoples. And so when the Bible in these instances, I just thought, oh, well, sacrificing meat to a false god is bad, and so that's why you don't eat it. No, they were warning you very specifically, like, by consuming this meal, you are foregoing your connection to Christ and your connection to your Christian brotherhood, or in the Old Testament to Yahweh, and instead you are embracing the gods of the city. You are closing yourself and becoming part of that particular people and their tradition and their worship, which is just a much heavier, it's always an important part of the Bible, but that really added an additional weight to that decision and that command to not engage in that behavior, because it's not just a like, oh, idols are bad thing. It's like, well, yes, but also there's a deep spiritual power to consuming this meal that you might not understand as a modern person, but would have been very apparent to the ancients.
Yeah, it isn't just spiritual. I mean, it is ultimately spiritual, but it's also like political and sociological, right? The sociological impact of idolatry is like maybe the main thing, like, and that's what you're bringing up. That and like a book that is great, is really really good on this, is Peter Leithart's Delivered from the Elements, where a lot of the stuff we've been talking about he goes over, and so like you're being bonded to the rest of the society in participating in these things. So really, like, the modern analog to that is like, if you're eating at the cafe that has the gay trans flag hanging over the front, like, yeah, don't eat that food. Right? Don't eat there. You're taking that food into your, so you're saying, I'm good with this, I'm part of this society, this thing, and I'm implicitly agreeing with everything all these people agree. I'm one of them, and don't do that. So
yeah, and I mean, that's like one of the reasons that Christianity was so polarizing, is because so much of the actual meat eaten is these public festivals. That's like when you have all the meat coming in, you sacrifice the bulls, all of these, hecatombs that you talk about in ancient history, and like every Roman festival, and there's like one practically every day in Rome in some corner of the city, in a big city like that. It's meat sacrificed to idols first and foremost, and then shared, maybe sent off, sold to the meat markets, and this stuff is just everywhere. Kind of like, at least recently we had a cafe near our house that stopped doing the pride flag for Pride Month. I think they sort of stuck their thumb in the air and figured out which way the wind was blowing.
That's right.
It was a big relief.
Yeah,
but yeah, it's hard to get away from this stuff.
Well, and it really is important, like you said, that this is why, first the Jews were such a problem for the Romans, and then the Christians, is they had specific requirements that mark them apart from imperial subjects, right? You can have whatever gods you want, as long as you're going to sacrifice to Caesar, as long as you just need to add it to your festivals, but we need you to take on some of the imperial cult so that we know you're subject to us, that you're fitting in, that you're part of this. And so by rejecting this, it's not just the ceremony. You're showing a civic disobedience, but also a unwillingness to integrate into the community, unwillingness to conform, and unwillingness to assimilate, as so many Americans want immigrants to do today. You're staking your flag and saying, no, this is not something I will participate in, and that's going to create a rift in that kind of social fabric, for the good, for those of us who want believe that ultimately the good is Christ. But that was a real civic concern, real political concern, also being addressed when people would not participate in those rituals. Thimplar says, Virgil, how do I say that one, guys?
Eclogues
are especially cool because Virgil begs for a few more years of life to live to see the child. He sadly died only 20 years before Jesus.
Yeah, man.
That stuff's everywhere if you're looking for it.
Yeah.
William Womble says, the AI aren't demons, just oracles that we seek truth from, whose minds their creators don't fully understand. They're not demons, they're just exactly demons. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. They're often wrong. It's weird.
And then Cage Minowara says, why are we assuming that all gods the pagans worshipped were demons? When you read the Bible, or when you read the stories of the Tutha de Dana, the way they tell humanity to live is pretty much the same as Mosaic law. Andrew, I'll let you handle that one.
Yeah, that's like a really good point as well. And the book that I referenced by Lightheart is really fascinating because he gets into these things that basically like he describes life in like ancient Egypt or ancient Persia or Greece, Rome, and shows that they all had very similar societal structures where there were different foods you could and could not eat. There were different, there were different sexual practices that were prohibited and were viewed as profane, or other ones that were viewed as very good. There's different clothes you could and couldn't wear, like all sorts of things that like you see in the Mosaic Law. It's just that all of these various civilizations, right? It was like looking at the Mosaic Law, but through like a funhouse mirror. Right. So it's just a little bit distorted. It's a little bit off. It's a little bit different. And you see that, and it's like, and they also had, gave people like moral law, and most of it was actually like, don't steal, don't lie, don't commit adultery, don't do all these things. Like it's very similar to the 10 Commandments, but sometimes it's just a little bit different. It's just a little bit off. And
I feel like those who are familiar with natural law would recognize this, right?
Yeah.
There is a level of natural law built into the universe because God created it. There's a certain amount of it that we can rationally or spiritually intuit, but there's also a revelatory part that goes beyond what we can intuit. And so the Mosaic Law might be echoed in civilizations that are observing some aspect of natural law, but it may not be correct. And it certainly, of course, isn't fulfilled without Christ. And so, this is why so many, the early church were able to draw on, pagans, still point out that they were making, Aristotle famously is a huge part of Catholic theology because Aristotle is observing things that are true about the world because God put them in there. That doesn't mean that Aristotle had the entire truth, but that doesn't mean you need to throw out everything that Aristotle understood because he was grasping something that Christianity could further elucidate once it was applied.
Yeah, you don't throw out the math textbook because it's not in the Bible, right?
Right.
Like things like that, and with that too, it's like it's interesting, right? I'm preaching through Genesis right now with my church, and the early parts of Genesis, right? You see things like like Cain and Abel are expected to know how to sacrifice properly, or Noah is expected to know what clean and unclean animals are, and this is centuries or millennia before the Mosaic Law is given to Moses, where all of it is elucidated. And so you're left with like one of two conclusions. One is that, right, they should have been able to deduce all these things on their own, which I think is difficult to get to. Or it's like, well, they had angels tell them what to do, and that's just not written down, right? And the place where it is written down is Paul says in Galatians that Israel was kept under the angels, right? That the law was administered to them via the hand of the angels. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. So if like the angels that are faithful to God and carrying out his will are doing that, right? Well, what is it the fallen ones, what are they throughout the rest of the world? What are they doing? And it's like, well, they're doing a counterfeit version of that. Right. And so a good counterfeit, right? Like if I was going to counterfeit a $20 bill, not that I would, but if I was going to, right, you want to make it as close to the real thing as possible, right? You don't want it to look like it was made in crayon. And so that's I think what they were doing. And so when the commenter brings this up, right, I think that's what took place in the ancient world is, right, demons were really truly actually governing the societies, and you don't want to govern a society that is totally totally messed up and chaotic and there's no order or anything like that. Like, no, all of these societies that were ruled by demons were like strong and powerful, And the thing that actually happened is the gospel comes and takes away all of the order and stability and security that it had. Like this big, powerful Roman Empire now falls apart, right? Why? It's because the thing that's holding it together is gone, right? This power that holds it together has been eradicated. And the same thing happens with the Aztecs, or the same thing happens everywhere else. That right, demonic power actually gives a lot of power and stability to these. Like, think of how long the Aztec
People were
Empire
worshiping
lasted.
this stuff for a reason. They're not just doing
Hundreds
it for
of
fun.
years.
Right.
Yeah, like millennia it lasts, right? And so there was real power there, real like sociological power to hold up an entire civilization together for a very, very long period of time. And then it goes away, it disappears, it collapses, it's gone. And so like I think that's why, right? They're not going to do stupid things, they're going to do clever and smart things.
And yet, natural law can, shine through and lead people to good deductions. I like this formulation that was made by an Orthodox bishop. I think he's talking about non-Orthodox Christians, but he said that I know where the church is, I know where Christ is, but I don't know where he isn't. And that signals a kind of openness that, if you look outside in the pagan world of pre-Christianity or, in other religions, you might find things that might indeed be good and might be some kind of preparatio evangelica, like preparation for the gospel in some economy that you don't understand. And it kind of brings me back to Elfenplar's comment on Virgil. Virgil, if you read his Aeneid, just as a historian or kind of a Roman scholar, it's this incredible prophetic or story of providence in history that I think the Romans needed to feel at that time after a period of great civil war and transition from republic to empire. But you can see a lot of that prophecy in a different light if you look at it as preparing the way for a political pax romana that could allow the spread of Christianity to take hold in this more powerful way and allow a greater transformation and fulfillment in the history of the West through the gospel. So, I say the more the merrier, but that's kind of, you have to know what is in the inner circle and what is on the fringes, and just be wary as you go along.
Well, once again, guys, I want to say thanks to both of you for making the time. I know some of you were taking a very important time out of, having a kid. Congratulations, Alex, and being on vacation, Andrew. So really appreciate you guys making the time. If you're not checking out both of their work, obviously you should be. This has been absolutely fascinating and great questions from the audience this time too. Yeah, always great to hear from you guys, but really elevated the conversation as well with that question answer period. So really appreciate you guys putting in the effort as well. If it's your first time on this channel, of course, please make sure you subscribe on YouTube, click the bell notification, because as you might imagine, this form of discussion gets a little less traffic from Google than, oh my gosh, we're going to war with Iran. So, help out, get people in here, drive some people over to the channel. If you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, remember, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. If you do leave that rating or review, it helps with the algorithm. And once again, everybody, really appreciate you listening. As always, we'll talk to you next time.